Without labor, there can be no payment, and vice versa. The country cannot progress. The workers are the tools that shape America.
Good to know. I was kind of feeling like a tool. And now I know why.
I've got a new question for you, friends. Should the United States increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour at the federal level? The other day, I came across a number of articles citing research from a restaurant operations service called Hari, which reported that increases in minimum wage reduced employee hours and raised prices for those businesses. And I thought that might be an interesting topic to discuss, being that it is a bit of a toasty one in terms of the United States for a number of reasons. We generally have a relatively lower minimum wage compared to similar nations, and it's often argued that minimum wage creates a cycle of poverty which restricts access to upward social and financial mobility. Many of those who fight for $15 an hour at the federal minimum wage level are adamant that they are incapable of putting food on their tables to support themselves and their families, given the current state of things in the United States, and are basically being forced to shout into the void of uncaring companies.
You have no brains, no ability, nothing! I quit!
I mean, this completely legitimate YouTube video with likes and comments disabled illustrates how callous companies are to the financial struggles of their employees. And in my sarcasm, it is true that many people who work for minimum wage rely on government support to sustain themselves. I'll be completely honest, when I was going to grad school, yes, I did have to rely on government assistance because I was making so little. And although difficult, I did make that work.
This isn't just for fun. I don't have any heating ducts in this apartment. It gets freezing in here at night, all right? Now, in case you have to pee-pee, I got this for you, all right? Oh my God!
And this kind of struggle is obviously not a desirable situation, as of course in a perfect utopia and world, no one would want for anything. But is the answer to the question of people earning less than they need a raise in the minimum wage? Many detractors suggest that a large increase in the minimum wage will cost jobs, hours, and wages, in addition to raising prices and harming businesses' bottom lines. But is there any evidence for any of that? Let's look at the data, both in support and in opposition to these two sides, to begin our examination by looking at the effects of hikes on minimum wage on employment and hours worked. One major fear critique, depending on your position, of more than doubling the current federal minimum wage from its status at $7.25 an hour as of this recording to $15 an hour is that increase on cost upon businesses could have deleterious effects, with many jobs potentially being lost as employers kill off more positions than in an Avengers movie. But is there any evidence for that? Let's start out with Lee, Shooter, and Rourke 2000, who examined the history of actual increases in wage over a period of 5 years using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in tandem with the National Bureau of Economic Research, and found that during the period of 1992 to 1996, generally speaking, more people made more money. What this meant in terms of the total population is that people making the minimum wage decreased over that period of time from 10.33% to 8.12%. And in contrast, higher paying jobs increased in representation, moving from 76.62% to 80.4% of the US population in total. However, is this because the minimum wage increased and therefore increased the upward financial mobility of people who previously made minimum wage? Well, looking at the specific market breakdowns, while the production of food decreased in employment during this time period, the number of minimum wage jobs in the food service industry increased. That is, people who produced the food, they made the buns, they made the patties, they made the lettuce and the tomatoes. They lost jobs, but in contrast, people in the food service industry, they gained jobs.
Nestle Crunch with the crispy rice removed. Weird choice, but for you, I got it done.
Gracias, señor.
Gracias. I find it incredibly demeaning, but guess what? Cash money!
And the reason why is likely because of automation across these various fields of industry, altering in response to wage increases. That being reflected in the number of minimum wage employees in the food production sectors, but not in the food service sectors. As you can see, outside of confections and baking, industries of food production massively downsized as wages increased. However, service working numbers increased as automation made the food production aspects less costly from a labor perspective. In 1992, prices for service increased the most in the same eating and drinking levels of production, while in comparison to the production price, there was a relative stagnation of products which themselves wound up ultimately on the plates and the glasses of the end users. In other words, during the early 90s, this was more related to the production side of things, with decreases in employment occurring only on the production side and not on the service side. But I think that things may be changing. After all, in current year, we can fairly easily replace many of the roles of a human with a machine to take your order and even produce it. Although it might not be quite perfected, it's certainly on its way as a growing trend.
But when it gets to this screen, we'll find that all the pattyless burgers had $1.10 taken off them, so they're all negative 10 cents. And there's our regular burger, which is just $1, leaving the total at $0.
Aronson and Fellon, 2017, drew data from various U.S. collection bureaus to study the effects of minimum wage increases on employment and separated job types into cognitive routine and manually routine low-wage jobs. While flipping burgers is a manual task of repetition, it takes about 30 minutes to learn how to use a cash register. And while there are manual aspects of that job as well, that is, automatically knowing which buttons to press, it is mostly a cognitive task of dealing with the customer, grading them, providing a positive face for the business. These researchers found that specifically looking at cashiers, they experienced a decrease in employment over the course of 10 years as the minimum wages increased. And similarly, they found this trend across all cognitive-heavy minimum wage jobs, with a similar decrease in available jobs in related industries of hospitality-oriented occupations. And that's interesting because the data from the earlier 90s that I mentioned before suggested that those type of hospitality jobs were the ones that were preserved over the more manual level jobs. And keep that in mind because it illustrates how technology possibly changes to affect the economy. At one point we could only automate the ability to, manufacture sandwiches, but now we can automate the service industry to a pretty significant degree to essentially cut out the human element, and that ability is growing by the second. Think about it. In the 1990s, innovation and automation was reasonably more focused on the kinds of manual roles that can be minimized as much as possible using assembly lines and constantly improving methods to reduce error, maximize speed, without sacrificing quality. Initially, this led to lowered need for a lot of employees on the production end of the food services. But as technology has marched forward into the 21st century and the cost of hiring employees has increased, more cognitive jobs have become affected as well. In terms of assembly line production, consider the need for sorters who can check that a product is acceptable. It's a much more cognitive-oriented task, and one that lately took a great loss during that era in the 90s. You know, which only 90s kids will remember, where some level of automation increased, but now again experiencing a decrease in jobs as machinery becomes more precise and incorporates new technologies such as object recognition. The lower the need for sorters and quality checkers, thus is the outcome. And the same thing applies now to the explosive growth of order kiosks that minimize the need for many servers or any servers, essentially replacing a large chunk of their jobs with a machine. All that's needed is for someone to manually operate the food production objects. Press the button to cook the burger. We still need some human input, but not necessarily on the service level anymore. And that might have a major effect on tipping behavior outside of more limited service industries like Speedway and getting a sandwich from a touchscreen. That same thing also applies to more full-service restaurants. I don't know if you've been to a Chili's lately, but similar sort of restaurants, casual dining experiences, are going the same direction. The hospitality aspect is now a colorful touchscreen that replaces the role of the waiter, who now becomes more akin to a busboy.
This pile of $1 bills represents your potential tip. Every time you please me, you'll see the pile grow.
And that might have a very major effect on tipping behavior as well, given that even as the minimum wage rises, this number remains significantly lower in jobs which anticipate tips, and eliminating perhaps the most important aspect of the waitstaff's interaction with guests may play a role in that decrease. By that I mean this. Normally the waiter walks up to you, they greet you with a pleasant smile and they ask you how your day has been. They take your order and they come back with whatever you described. They provide a pleasant attitude and respond to any of your needs and desires. And in response, they anticipate a tip, knowing that given that in America, we all know that they are not paid minimum wage.
I used to work minimum wage, and when I did, I wasn't lucky enough to have a job the society deemed tip-worthy.
You don't care they're counting on your tips to live?
You know what this is? It's the world's smallest violin playing just for the waitresses.
Thus, we grade them upon the quality of service rather than a generic baseline. But as automation increases across the service industry, this may play a real role in how much waiters or waitresses receive in compensation for tips in a number of ways. But for right now, let's talk about touch, which I know sounds weird, but stay with me here.
Bad touch, stranger danger.
If you're a waiter or waitress, be sure to touch people, not in a creepy way, but listen to me for a second. A classic piece of seminal research, the research, not the fluid, from Crusko and Wetzel 1984 indicated that waitresses who gently touched a customer on the hand or shoulder when they returned change from a check, something which in and of itself has been removed from many interactions and instances of customer service at this point, being mostly conducted through credit cards, received higher tips than those who did not touch the shoulder or hands of their patrons. This effect was even found in French cafes, wherein tipping is atypical, who found that waitresses who lightly touch customers were more likely to receive any tips at all, as seen in Guggen and Jacob, 2005. In other words, interaction impacts tipping behavior, even in countries where tipping is seen as kind of abnormal. Without this similar capacity or physical contact and connection to their patrons, waiters and waitresses may lose tips. And there are other issues faced by tipped employees as well, namely that as minimum wage goes up, their own pay rarely does. A study from 7 Shifts, a restaurant operations and marketing company, conducted a survey of 1,600 restaurant employees in 2019 and found that these workers rarely reported increases in their take-home pay even as minimum wage increased. And while 64% of those within regions that received the minimum wage reported no change in their tips, 24% reported a decrease in tipping, and only 3% said they received more tips than before the minimum wage hike. When asked about why they thought this may be, 45% of respondents said that they believed it was a product of customers believing them to be making more money and therefore no longer in need of tips to sustain themselves. Despite the fact that all of these programs were incorporating higher minimum wages over a prolonged period of time, and at that point they were still not meeting the federal minimum wage. Well then, obviously the problem is in raising the minimum wage without raising the tipped minimum, right?
Do you know how hard it is to do my job? Do you know how hard it is to walk up to a table and ask that table what it wants to eat? And then walk away from that table? And let Mexicans do all the rest of the work, you know?
Well, Lin and Boone, 2015, in a study boldly titled, "Have Minimum Wage Increases Hurt the Restaurant Industry?" The evidence says no. Whoa, Lin and Boone getting a little spicy there with that exclamation mark, but despite their claim and being so accurate, definitively no, when we look at what they actually found, the findings aren't that exciting. In fact, I think they're more interesting for me being a little bit critical of them. While they found that there was no evidence of a decrease in employment after minimum wage hikes, a 10% increase in minimum wage resulted in less than a 1% increase in total wages earned for tipped employees, and a 10% increase in tipped minimum wage resulted in an increase outcome of 0.5%. In other words, even when we directly raise the tipped minimum by 10%, a mere half a percentage increase is felt in the pockets of the tipped workers. But hey, it did go up a bit, so you might think then that the answer to this possible problem for tipped workers is to simply raise the tip credit minimum. But research from Even and McPherson 2013 indicated that after an increase in minimum wage for tipped workers, while they did earn more money weekly, fewer of them did so, as employment decreased in full-service restaurants and across several other industries that employed tipping behaviors. There were fewer jobs and fewer hours. This can be backed up from a number of reports from employees aggregated in Long 2018, with workers in Maine in 2016 reporting earning less after a minimum wage increase. And employees noted that many customers ended up saying things like this in response to the hike. Quote, "Since you make the regular minimum wage now, should I still tip 20%? This all resulted in Maine servers forming a coalition to lobby against hikes in minimum wages and return the tip credit.
There's my flare, okay? And this is me expressing myself, okay? There it is. I hate this job. I hate this goddamn job and I don't need it.
Further examples can be seen from the District of Columbia, which under Initiative 77, passed in June of 2018, designed to phase in an increase of tipped wages from $3.33 till it hit minimum wage of $15 an hour. But this phase-in would take until 2025 to come into full effect. And nearly immediately, servers reported a loss in tips, with one woman noting that she received a $50 tip on a $1,321 bill, accompanied by a note saying, "Congratulations on your raise." Wow. absolutely savage.
Oh, I'm sorry. And there's plenty more where that came from.
Of course, that ultimately didn't matter because that initiative was overturned in October of the same year. But it is important to note that it was servers who ultimately wanted to keep the ability to earn tips, providing that they gave better service. Even when we specifically increase the minimums of tipped employees, they may still ultimately lose out. Maybe just tipping in general is a mistake. But this is America, god dang it. Tipping is an institution like driving my mobility scooter with a pair of truck nuts on the back to McDonald's and shoving my order of 2 number 9s, a number 9 large, number 6 with extra dip, a number 7, 2 number 45s, one with cheese, and a large soda into the barrel of a shotgun and blasting that beatus straight into my own face.
That's America, buddy! Just remember, Abraham Lincoln didn't die in vain. He died in Washington, D.C.
Yet despite all of this that we've looked at, Dokogliaglos and Stanley 2009 conducted an impressive, and I really mean impressive, I mean dang, look at this funnel, meta-analysis of 64 studies on minimum wage and employment between 1972 and 2007 and found that there was little to no impact on the number of those unemployed and the increase in minimum wage. But let's consider what this really means. Many advocates for a higher minimum wage will cite studies like this without realizing the implications of this very, again, impressive meta-analysis, because these data are pretty much incontrovertible. And this is not the only meta-analysis that finds this kind of stuff, there's tons. This is just the most robust. So yes, unemployment itself as a general trend may not increase with the increase of the minimum wage, but is it because people tend to seek out jobs in different areas to supplement the change in their occupation that causes this considerable consistency across employment regardless of changes in minimum wage rates? That might be so if we consider moving from one relatively low-skill job to another, but as we have discussed, over a long period of time and as automation increases, that may potentially decrease as well as the number of people working in minimum wage low-skill jobs seems to decrease. First we saw it with food production, and now we're seeing it more with food service. I must be clear that this indicates there will not be an increase in unemployment overall, but as we've seen, that this effect can affect specific types of jobs and industries at different periods of time as technology that is related to that field increases and diversifies. And accounting for changes in technology may provide us with an answer for why some of these very robust studies, such as that of Dokogliaglos and Stanley, adjusting for publication bias, that the majority of effects on minimum wage increases and employment cluster near zero. Despite finding that, there are other massive meta-analyses, such as the work of Newmark and Washer 2006, in a more qualitative assessment of over 102 studies of minimum wage hikes, taking the 33 that they believe to be the most thorough in multiple countries, contesting that there is a definitive disemployment reaction to wage raises, and found that in 85% of studies, that debate between whether or not ultimately, or over a long term, or across all situations, increase in minimum wage decreases employment is still up for debate. Precisely, I believe, because it seems to affect some areas and some people and some fields, while not others at certain times or in certain instances.
This is getting us nowhere. Can we move on to DNA test,
Yeah,
please?
can you
That's
do
a good idea.
test?
DNA is good.
Yeah, I can't do that. What do you mean? Aren't you a scientist?
Yeah, do it.
No, I'm an econ major. I just wanted to look at some poop.
Oh.
So let's consider for a moment then why there might be such a disconnect across the research by looking at the potential influence of automation on minimum wage at both the macro and the micro level. The fact that this debate continues to rage on, and I have to say it's a pretty amusing debate from my spurgy autismo perspective, because these economists, they be casting some shade back and forth at one another like an awning expo.
What smells rotten and puts people to sleep?
Noxious gas?
No!
Ead and Paladin.
The Newmark and Washer book that I mentioned briefly above has itself been widely criticized, and those two scholars have come back with several responses in their own 2013 finding an average decrease in teen employment between 1990 and 2011, after wage hikes as averaging 3% over time, but no other significant effects on restaurant employment. In other words, it seems that minimum wage hikes may uniquely affect teenagers or young people. Further, Jardim et al. 2018 found that in Seattle between 2015 2015 to 2017, when the minimum wage increased from $9.47 an hour to $13 an hour, that while the average employee reaped the benefits of a higher average wage, it had no effect on newer hires, who received fewer hours and lessened work opportunities, ultimately causing a reduction in new entrants to the industry. In other words, it kept the new blood out. That is particularly potentially detrimental to teens who work in the restaurant industry because in the restaurant industry, they comprise the majority of it. With the demographics of the restaurant industry in general as of 2019 in an estimate by 7 Shifts, noting that 62% of restaurant workers were between the ages of 16 and 25. And that, quote, the average restaurant worker is a 20-year-old female attending college. Meaning that being young and inexperienced in addition to working in the service industry may have a much harder hit on the wallet of the individual than the market at large. While the average citizen may not be affected directly by an increase in minimum wage, those working at Good Burger very well might.
I am reporting your name to the manager!
The manager already knows my name.
Oh, I'll see you in hell!
Okay, see you there!
And my point in telling you all of this seemingly conflicting information is because despite being a widely studied topic, there is still no complete academic consensus on the effects of minimum wage raises across all circumstances, occupations, and age groups. And across all available data, most have assessed minimum wage increases in the vicinity of 20 to 40% increases. And to put that into perspective, in California, a federal minimum wage hike from the current $11 an hour to $15 is not an unheard of increase of 45%. But in states like my home one of West Virginia, of the current $8.75, would result in a staggering 72% increase in minimum wage. And while the existence of a federal minimum wage is likely a good thing that prevents employers from abusing employees, given the ongoing dispute across experts who have spent their entire careers studying minimum wage impacts and still can't come to a consensus, and that there's this much disagreement arising between those who look at the more microeconomic analysis of specific demographics, occupations, and areas, finding more definitive negative effects, while those who take a much more broader macroeconomic stance finding no long-term effects, I think we need tread very lightly when considering the massive potential raise of the federal minimum wage. Because from what we've seen so far regarding these big studies assessing decades of raise hikes, it seems that those who it affects the most are those in the positions most susceptible to increases in automation. Teenagers and people in industries that did experience greater automation over time, such as food production and more recently, more cognitive jobs such as front-end service at fast food restaurants and full-service restaurants in general. So, while there may be limited effects on a macro level, it seems that those with more limited skill sets are often the ones most likely to see deleterious impacts of long-term financial struggle as their jobs become automated, spurred on, perhaps, by the cost of automation ultimately suppressing and superseding any benefits of having human employees from a financial standpoint of an organization. By that I mean this. Consider the changes we've seen just over the last couple of decades in the average supermarket or burger joint. Would you rather self-checkout or order your Burger King burger with extra foot lettuce at a machine rather than deal with an employee? Which, I don't know about you, but is my own personal hell. Often the machine is annoying, but at least it's more or less consistent. Not always, but more or less. While humans themselves are highly variable. And consider the position of the employer. Low-skill employees may now cost more than to pay to upkeep a machine. This does not necessarily, however, mean a decrease in overall employment, as now there's a need for more skilled workers who know how to repair and upkeep the machinery that has replaced the lower-skill employees. As such, from a macro level, we may see no decrease in employment rates, but we may potentially see a change in the demography. It is possible that the people most likely to be injured by this change in increasing the minimum wage are those who do not have the necessary skills to adapt to this. And that's going to mean people who are general laborers, people in service positions, and people without a lot of skill sets, such as teenagers or young people. And probably the worst thing about that means that teenagers are less likely to get experience and therefore have fewer opportunities going forward, as these low-skill opportunities and positions quickly dissolve. Looking further, a study from Jardim et al. 2017 may emphasize the potential effects of minimum wage increase on low-wage, non-full-time employees, given that they may receive fewer weekly hours. There's a lot to take away from this graph that you're looking at. For example, that the number of employees working for the raised minimum wage decreased while those making more than the minimum wage increased. In addition, the total number of hours worked per employee dropped, as did the payroll for minimum wage employees, indicating that total hours and money being paid to those earning the minimum wage decreased, while jobs earning more than the minimum wage increased in number and in payout. At least in the restaurant industry, which was being assessed here. Kind of illustrating what I said before. The higher skilled jobs became more valuable, whereas the lower skilled jobs became replaced. For the minimum wage employees in Seattle where this study was conducted, employees lost about 9% of their previously worked hours and suffered a decrease on average of $125 from their paychecks a month. This is likely because stores did as I suggested, tended to automate and hire more skilled employees, ultimately not leading to a decrease in overall employment numbers, but to a decrease in work hours by those with less specific skill sets. There are more reasons than just pure money to automate as well. For example, store shelves are stocked by people who often have to lift over 50 pounds of goods, and for the maximization of their time, they also need to be familiar with the location of every object in the store. But hey, now robots can do the same job faster and more accurately. And most importantly, from an economic perspective, if the robot breaks down, it needs only be repaired, or at worst, replaced. While if an employee throws out his or her back, that's a massive financial settlement facing the business. Again, the robot does not necessarily replace a job, it instead changes the job and types of skills needed by employees from a human with a low skill standpoint to a human with a higher skill standpoint. So people most likely to be displaced from a position are those low skill job positions. But be aware, you're not necessarily not susceptible yourself, as automation is quickly becoming available for even more complex jobs. Look at this sushi restaurant that 3D prints your sushi, which for some reason uses urine and saliva and feces to custom print your meal based on the contents of your bodily fluids for some reason. But hey, the point is, making sushi is an incredibly high-skilled job, and even something as complex as that may now see a level of displacement as automation increases. Although I'm not sure the sous shit idea is really likely to catch on.
Yum.
So, what is the demographic that lacks any kind of advanced skills and likely works as a supermarket clerk or a barista? Well, oftentimes it's the people who are most adamant for a raise in the minimum wage, which again will not necessarily create fewer minimum wage jobs, but may accelerate the implementation of automation technologies to replace those very kind of low-skill positions. If you have a degree in women's studies and no practical experience or skills, sorry, but it is your job, first and foremost, which is likely to disappear. Or perhaps not so accurately disappear, but rather mutate, as your former employer now employs a skilled technician who knows how to fix and repair the machine that takes the order, brews the coffee, and serves it, instead of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez herself preparing your overly specific order and often failing to meet the standards of perfection that a machine can, when it works.
When I worked at Starbucks, I hated people like you. You're the
For
worst.
asking for extra ice?
No, the whole thing, and a splash of soy milk.
Because if you say soy milk, they go doop, 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 doop. No, I don't even say soy milk. I go, listen.
Oh.
A small splash.
Let's provide a little bit of a theoretical framework here, and I know a lot of people shrink back in fear when you mention the fascinating but ultimately really benign text of The Bell Curve by Dr. Charles Murray and the late Dr. Richard Herrnstein. But the main thesis of that book has very little to do with race, which it is often attributed, being that only a single chapter is dedicated to race, but rather with skill and the changing economic landscape becoming increasingly important to society. Dr. Murray and his co-author were not describing the average difference between white and black IQ because they wanted to have a little giggle at the ignorant Negro. Quite the opposite, in fact. As you can read in more of Murray's book, Coming Apart, and I would really recommend reading for yourself, the overwhelming concern behind the bell curve was that as technology progresses, the need for low-skill labor will eventually dissipate and be replaced with technical jobs, and that people with higher IQs will generally be more able to adapt to this change in society. However, a single standard deviation across large population groups means that on average, and remember this never describes a single individual, but only averages, and on average, the African American and Hispanic communities will receive a relative economic disadvantage due to this dissimilarity. Obviously, countless black people are brain surgeons or rocket surgeons or what have you, but when we look at the macro level of economics, this transitions into a higher skill set defining even minimum wage positions, and may uniquely therefore impact black people and Hispanic people more than it does, for example, Asians or white people. Similarly, it's likely to impact rural Appalachia, as they have less access to abilities to gain greater skill sets. And thus, you could say that IQ is entirely environmental or entirely genetic, and either way, it ends up being deleterious to these vulnerable populations, just as it is potentially deleterious to gender studies majors.
Are you in a rush?
Yeah, actually, I kind of have to go, so...
Can I do my impression of you?
Yeah, actually, I've got to go.
Oh, that book's on my list.
Oh, can you put that away, please?
It's over there.
Every time you point, I see a penis.
If you don't have skills, or if it's more difficult for you to obtain skills due to your lack of access or your lack of talent, you will be the one who takes the hit financially in the long run. So, we've looked at the effects of minimum wage increase on availability of jobs, disemployment, and have begun to discuss the ways in which automation potentially also plays a role in this change and the types of jobs which, based on the variety of factors, may ultimately suffer from this increase over time. However, what about the impact of minimum wage on the increase of prices of food and goods for customers and their affected businesses? Who ultimately foots the bill of an increase in minimum wage? Before we go forward, I need to explain a little something to explicate the full effects and the cost of consumption of price goods. And to do that, I must briefly describe price elasticity, as it is a measure that is most commonly used in the analyses I'm about to describe. Prices tend to be more elastic in a free market with competition. For example, if the cost of beef goes up due to an increase in, cattle abductions.
You're not going to tell me you think this is that Mexican goat sucker thing.
El Chupacabra? No, they got 4 fangs, not 2. And they suck goats, hence the name.
Then people may switch to chicken patties. The basic equation for price elasticity, therefore, is the percentage of change in demand over the percentage of price change. The most elastic products are those which are commodities that we can easily live without, and for which we have no brand attachment. Most people need to buy gasoline, thus even when prices skyrocket, people will continue to buy it, although they may drive less and only when necessary. In the beef example, if I'm bonkers for bovines, I may continue to purchase beef products regardless of the price because I love the meat so much. But when we consider commodities, going out to eat is certainly not something most of us need to do. So changes in price at restaurants might be particularly elastic, as people may choose to not eat out and instead stay home and save their money. The only instances where price is almost unilaterally inelastic are in the cases of monopolies. Consider the recent kerfuffle regarding the exclusives on the Epic Games Store, which has riled up a lot of consumer rage, and justifiably so, I would say, as the company now maintains exclusive rights to sell games such as The Division 2 and Metro Exodus, as well as the upcoming Borderlands 3, which destroys competition and allows Epic Games to set the prices. We see similar things in the growing number of streaming services. Remember the pastoral days of yore, when you had but a simple Netflix account?
여보! What's Netflix and that chill?
Sex.
How you know that?
Everybody know that.
I don't know that.
You is old.
Anyway, the point is, let's wrap this up and get back to the numbers by first doing something a little bit more fun, a bit of math. Let's say I want to add a new figure to my collection, for scientific purposes. But there's been a decrease in production of plastics in Japan due to the release of a new Monster Hunter game, resulting in rampant work absence. So the price has raised dramatically. Rather than immediately buying my delicious new figure, I will hold off and wait until either the market balances out or I become incapable of restraining myself. Anyway, let's do the math. Let's say that my figure costs $100, and this increase in the price of plastics increases that price to $120. That's a 20% raise. In response, the company's sales drop from 1,000 figures to 900 figures. That's a 10% decrease in sales. Put together into our equation, this is 10 over 20, or a price elasticity of 0.5. Just note that the larger the number, the more elasticity. What we have to pay attention to here today is how much elasticity is related to change in minimum wage. If the minimum wage hike is 20% and the elasticity is 1%, then the alteration has very little pass-through of payment towards the customer and remains shouldered on the employer or the employee. The higher the number, the more burden falls upon the consumer. Numbers! You guys follow me there? I hope so, because I'm moving back into the data using information from examples of minimum wage increase. Aronson, French, and McDonald 2008 looked at the minimum wage increases between 1995 and 1997, a period of increase we've already looked at in regards to how it impacted the industry side of things, during which time the federal minimum was raised from $4.25 to $5.15 an hour in 2 stages so as to attempt to ease the economy into the change. Using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the reported prices of 7,500 food items at over 1,000 different restaurants across the United States, they found 22.6% of items increased in price at limited service restaurants, that is casual dining and primarily counter-service restaurants, while there was an increase of only 12% in comparison at full-service restaurants, wherein the federal minimum for employees who received tips remained at a stationary $2.13, making an assessment of this period particularly interesting as it indicates a non-direct effect of minimum wage hikes on product costs even when the majority of employees do not reap the benefits of that hike in full-service restaurant environments. Looking specifically at price elasticity, they found an elasticity of 7% across all restaurants. This was particularly potent in limited service restaurants, which saw an elasticity of 15% in comparison to full-service restaurants, which saw an elasticity of only 3%. Again, remember that elasticity means more effect on the consumer. An earlier study from Aronson 2001, using data from the US and Canada between 1986 and 1993, found that there was a similar level of change in price elasticity across fast food restaurants of varying types, including McDonald's and KFC, was relatively inelastic, with McDonald's and KFC rating at 5% and 6% elasticity respectively, but with Pizza Hut receiving an elasticity rating of less than 1%. In other words, it seems that pizza is more economically stable. I wonder what could be behind this tendency.
Get the hot and ready lunch combo for the unbelievable price of just $4.
But I'll tell you what I think could be. It potentially makes sense as ordering a pizza is far more common of a family or group behavior than it is going to grab a bucket of chicken. You know, like a real American. So to look further into this, let's get rid of those meddling Canucks from our dataset. Basker and Kahn, 2016, found a similar thing when looking only at US data, that pizza remained generally unaffected by the increase in price seen at chicken and burger joints. Again, I would surmise this is because pizza, at least in the United States, is a, I don't know what's for dinner tonight, let's just get a pizza social institution. Some more recent research from Allegretto and Reich.
What signal is he doing there then, James?
He's saying, take the Third Reich.
Looked at an increase in minimum wage in San Jose in 2012. As in that year, the city raised the minimum wage from $8 an hour to $10 and assessed the changes in the cost of food at restaurants. While the effects of the minimum wage hike increased the average wage within the city, as we would expect, these effects also extended to the end products of the food industry. After the city raised the minimum wage, as you can see here, the cost of food increased price elasticity by an average of 6% within the limits of the San Jose area across all restaurants, already themselves being higher in cost than restaurants in the surrounding regions as minimum wage increased. This was particularly potent in medium-sized restaurants, wherein it increased by 10 and 8% for specifically limited service restaurants, although it was still increased by 4% in full-service restaurants, again, them being less affected by changes in the minimum wage. This all indicates that the cost of minimum wage hiking may be felt in the pockets of the consumer when it comes to restaurant businesses changing their prices. Interestingly, after the initial increase of minimum wage from $8 to $9 dues, while wages increased in the San Jose area, they also rose across all of Santa Clara County, as employers likely foresaw the competition for employees arising with comparatively higher wages in the city proper. The researchers suggest that the increase in wages decreased turnover, which is a really big deal because turnover is a major financial problem within the food service industry. For example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics Job Earnings and Labor Turnover Survey found that restaurants saw over 70% turnover rates, and turnover means a hefty price of bringing in and training new employees. Similar reports of turnover can be seen in a 2018 report from the Food Service Operative System Upserve and the 7 Shifts 2019 analysis. As a result, restaurants were able to considerably save money by reducing turnover rates, resulting from minimum wage increases being passed on to the consumer. Yet it does still seem that the consumer bears the majority of the burden. And this potentially extends beyond the food industry, which I know I've been focusing on, as Otten et al. 2018 surveyed both profit and non-for-profit child care centers in the city of Seattle, which is slowly phasing in a $15 minimum wage over the course of several years. And given that in 2014, when this increase began, child care workers on average made above minimum wage, as the citywide minimum rose, 41% of child care centers had to raise the wages of their employees by more than 10%, indicating that as minimum wages increased, jobs which were once above the minimum wage became minimum minimum wage positions naturally.
Minimum wage, maybe? Minimum wage?
Are you kidding me?
That's great. That's more than
Absolutely.
we
That's a
expected.
government salary
All
right there. Yeah.
Across both profit and non-profit childcare centers, employers reported they were forced to increase tuition and reduce hours to meet the new minimum costs. But these employers, from a qualitative assessment, highly valued their employees and instead tried to increase job satisfaction to appease their workers who were once making relatively slightly above the minimum but were now officially minimum wage employees. The majority of the cost, however, across these institutions was absorbed by the parents, which means potentially negative outcomes both for teachers who may lose hours or benefits and parents who may become incapable of paying for childcare. One director explained that before the minimum wage hike, their enrollment had included 25% children who received public assistance through the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services. But after the hike, that percentage had been reduced to 6%. Again, this indicates a pass-through effect wherein a portion of rates in minimum wage is transferred onto the consumer, if not the majority portion, causing that consumer to make decisions about the necessity of the service itself and increasing price elasticity, not only in things we can more easily choose to purchase or not to purchase, but even important necessities such as childcare. And on that note, it's important to mention another study conducted during the same time period by the Seattle Minimum Wage Study Team in 2016, who similarly found a decrease in hours worked and concluded that the maintenance of total job security during a period of wage increases up to 2015 was due precisely to the strength of the current economy. Again, illustrating how fluid and potentially malleable any of these findings may be. They also found that across most areas of Seattle, teachers made above the minimum wage before the hike, further illustrating that the cost of raising the minimum wage will be passed on elsewhere, usually to the consumer, and only causing more people to make the minimum wage rather than to make above it.
This is only in Seattle, where someone is wearing no shoes or socks. What? Who are you people?
Thus, we may not see changes in employment because more or less people are not being hired, potentially because more people are being hired to work fewer hours and may not always see any long-term effects of raises in either the price or in their own paycheck. And another assessment of minimum wage increases in restaurants can be found in Hirsch, Kaufman, and Zelenska 2011, who examined restaurants in Alabama and Georgia during the 41% federal minimum wage increase between 2007 and 2009 from $5.15 to $7.25, and found that, as we've seen so far, the majority of that cost was transferred onto the consumer, with 2/3 of the increase of raising the minimum price being transferred onto menu items. However, other elements such as decreased turnover may have allowed companies to maintain their employees who lost neither jobs nor hours, yet did lose overtime work. This increase had no effect on the number of people making above the minimum. In other words, increasing minimum wage likely places a higher percentage of the population upon the minimum wage salary. This means in some instances, as we have seen, people lose hours if not their jobs themselves. And further, the cost of their lost hours is often compounded financially with the increased raise in costs they themselves as they purchase goods. Findings from McDonald and Nielsen 2016 on various cities in the Beast Coast indicate that the effects of increases in prices decrease over time, which is important to note though. Using US data from 1978 to 2015, they found that price increases in goods after a minimum wage hike returned towards a prior mean within a month. This indicates that for a long time now, businesses have found other ways of reducing costs to the consumer in potential response to increased price elasticity, likely by cutting hours, finding other ways to reduce spending, without passing it through to the consumer. And this may very likely involve automation and the replacement of low-skilled jobs with high-skilled jobs. A more recent study from Hari 2019, that one I mentioned in the opening forever ago, and who I attempted to speak to but seemed to just want to sell me their service rather than providing me with the raw data that I requested. So I have to actually just use a AP reported source, and as such this is the only study I'm talking about here today that I have not directly read all of the data for, which really boils my butt, but as they found that of restaurateurs, 71% responded to an increase in minimum wage hikes by raising menu prices and passing the cost through to the consumer. And honestly, what else is the employer to do? We've seen they don't necessarily enjoy having to cut the hours of their workers, but they also fear price elasticity and financial detriments that are incurred by raises in the minimum wage, at least immediately. Be this hike in wage being incremental over time, as is typical today, or immediate. This means that for many employers, although they may want to maintain their employees, they also need decreased cost. And automation, therefore, is a tempting option, if not the most tempting option. You can maintain a certain number of employees, but remove those now less necessary given automation options over a long period of time. And again, this will not be detectable from a macro-level analysis of total jobs, as they do not decrease, but the types of jobs and the demography of jobs do. This allows for employers and companies to reduce elasticity caused by decreased demand that is incurred by higher pass-through of cost to the end user via replacing higher employee costs with automation. Therefore, it is detectable at the micro level, but not necessarily at the macro level as we've seen today. So we've learned a lot about how raises in the minimum wage may potentially impact or not impact the employment rate of workers, including work hours and pay received. And we've also seen how cost is often offset by employers by passing it through to consumers in price raises. So let's take everything we've discussed today and form a couple of simple conclusions. What does all of this mean, taken together? Well, really that's up for you to decide. But at least for me, at its best it seems that increasing the minimum wage has little to no effect on society overall, from an immediately observable standard at least. What it does likely impact is those with minimal skills attempting to work part-time or temporary jobs to support themselves, though.
Do you have any experience in this field?
I've done quite a lot, actually. I mean, not formal filing, but, you know, alphabeticizing the videos, doing the spices. I suppose what I'd want to do is build on that experience in a professional sphere.
Those who are the most affected by increases in the minimum wage negatively, from everything that I have seen, are teenagers and young people, those who generally lack advanced skill sets that can be automated out of existence, those new to an industry, those who receive tips from any industry, and full-service restaurant workers especially. So, who was most negatively affected by an increase in minimum wage? Again, young people, particularly women, African American and Hispanic people if we apply Murray's hypothesis of skill and IQ, and the uneducated or unskilled in general. The most vulnerable populations, according to the very narrative of the people so often lobbying for this increase in the federal minimum wage, are the very same populations most likely to see a negative outcome as a result of it. And we've seen that from the examples of servers who suddenly received higher tip credit minimums almost immediately requesting these increases be repealed and the tip system be reintegrated. While those are mostly anecdotal, we've seen the actual data illustrate that at very best, increased minimum wage does not hurt tipping. Although it does potentially increase wages to a significant degree, it doesn't necessarily increase outcomes. Due to the pass-through effect of cost onto customers, those who work minimum wage jobs may now need to pay more for the goods and services that they themselves utilize, regardless of whether or not they work for those same companies, which ultimately equals out to little to no net gain, even by the best estimates. I don't see any evidence that it actually increases upward financial mobility. It seems to at best mean fewer minimum wage jobs. Or more people working more minimum wage jobs, depending on which piece of data we look at. Again, this is very contentious. Overall, what I see from this is that while employees might earn more, goods cost more, which likely obtains equilibrium. So I need to be really clear. Although I talked about it at length earlier, there's still a huge amount of debate on this issue, and honestly, a lot of the data are really up in the air, with most of the modern macro-level research finding no negative effects of total employment and wages on minimum wage increase, but with individual micro-level studies reporting much more deleterious effects in specific services and industries. For this reason, I have to put this question up to you, dear friends. What do you think would be the ultimate outcome of a federal minimum wage hike to $15 an hour? I ask because I don't know, honestly. I mean, the leading economists don't appear to know, so I obviously have no idea. But from reading the research and trying to provide evidence that is both positive and negative and give a balanced look at this topic, I must ask you, what do you think?
1 hour later.
Anyway, I'm sorry, but that just happens to be how I feel about it. What do you think? Just a question.
As I've indicated, and based on everything I've read, I tend to think that raising the minimum wage will ultimately have no negative impacts on employment in aggregate, but it will negatively impact service industries over a long period of time and result in increases in automation, ultimately leading to a significant society-level change in worker demographics of low-skill, low-labor, hospitality-oriented, or cognitively-oriented low-wage jobs, but not necessarily in jobs overall. Oh, that was a lot. But the point is, in the wake of all this, new innovations will create new jobs for new positions of workers, but not for those low-skill ones. And that's kind of the problem, right? You might ask, how could technological advances possibly be a net negative? And again, looking at the macro level, they're probably not. But at the micro level, they may have some serious negative impacts on certain groups, including, again, young and unskilled people, which we've already seen with many millennials and even now Zoomers reporting essentially checking out from normal society because they can't seem to find a job. Well, why can't they find a job? The data indicate it's because of a raising of the minimum wage. That very raise that they themselves are often so likely to request. The hike also seems to particularly negatively affect the food industry, which overwhelmingly employs young women. As wages increase in the service industry, so too have we seen the increase in service-related automation, drops in tips, work hours, and ultimately hiring of young people. Finally, if we were to accept Murray's thesis that these effects would also particularly negatively affect the Black and Hispanic communities in the United States, based on very general, lower IQ, and while the data overwhelmingly indicate that both genetics and environment, to a lesser degree, play a role on IQ, then these communities would be more left behind as the American economy moved towards more technical and high-skill occupations. What this all means, altogether, is that most of the people that increased minimum wages seems to appeal to as a political outcome, young people in general, particularly young women, minorities, particularly those from environments that lack adequate access to opportunities to gain skills or learn trades, and the generally impoverished are the most likely to suffer from an increase in minimum wages at the federal level. But hey, again, I'm just basing that on my interpretation of the data. Will majorly increasing the US minimum wage ameliorate poverty or potentially exacerbate it? Will it do nothing at all? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you enjoy my content and are in the Chicago, Illinois area, I will be speaking at the International Conference on Men's Issues on August 16th through the 19th, or if you are in the New Jersey, Philadelphia area, I will also be speaking at Minds IRL on August 31st in Pittman, New Jersey. I would love to see you guys at either event, and I am so incredibly grateful to be invited to speak there. A wonderful thank you to all of you, my amazing supporters on Patreon, Subscribestar, and Streamlabs. It is because of you guys that I am able to engage in maximum research spurgery in these videos. I really, truly thank you guys. Finally, if you want to hear me in my natural environment of turbo nerdery, you can catch me every Tuesday on our Pathfinder game, Tales from My Wife's Son, on Nuckalavi's channel, linked either above or below. Now officially, the best pseudo-political sphere role-playing game on YouTube since D&D Crusaders is dead. RIP. JK, get dunked on Sargon. Bill is a superior DM in all aspects. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and as always, my friends, Altana Volt.